In this video, we will have a closer look at the color adjustments in Photoshop, and we will see several examples how to use it in creative ways. Starting with this image right here, with this nice car and the background, let's say we want to only have colors on the car. So the way I would normally do that is to first make a selection, but I actually have this selection saved. So I'm just going to go to the select menu, load selection. I will also click on invert in the load selection dialog box because I made the selection of the car, but I actually want the adjustment to go on the background. So that's why I chose invert. Once I click OK, you will see that's exactly what I get. So everything selected apart from the car. And I mainly use the quick selection tool here and a bit of quick mask painting over some details. And I made sure I don't select anything from the background, even what I see through the glass here. So once I have the selection ready, I can now click on the black and white adjustment layer, which will then be added. And that looks really good already. But if I want, I can make some additional changes, like using these values here, reds, yellows, greens, to adjust how they translate to black and white. The lower I move these values, the darker those original colors will get in the image. Higher I move them, the brighter they get. So because on the road there were quite a lot of red colors, increasing the reds will make the road much brighter. Another color which was very dominant in the background was yellows. So if I increase that, then almost everything is going to get brighter. Of course, we can always reset black and white option. Just click on that icon there. And if you want, you can also use this cursor, the hand tool, within the properties panel. I call this the on image editing option, with which I can click on certain details and drag right and left to adjust those values. And it will automatically pick the corresponding color from the properties panel. But one last thing I would do in this case is to add the tint option, again within the properties panel, which will then turn everything into this monochrome sepia color. But of course that can be changed as well. By clicking on the tint, we can pick whatever tint we wish. So I could choose different hues and then even adjust the color itself if I want. But I actually like the original tint, so I'm just going to click on cancel because I think that really works well with this composition. And of course later on, if you ever want to reduce the amount of an effect, just go to the opacity panel and reduce the opacity of your adjustment layer. That way you can reveal a bit of the original colors, which I think again is a useful step here. So that was with 100%. And now I'm using the shortcut pressing 7 to go down to 70%. That's actually, I think, is a good combination. So this is the original image and this is without adjustment. So all the colors in the background are toned down while the car stayed with the full intensity of the original colors. But let's see another technique which is even faster than this to separately turn the image into black and white. We also call these type of effects color pop. So here I am going to use hue saturation adjustment layer. This is another one we use a lot whenever we want to adjust colors, because here we can adjust the hue, which will change all the hues in the image. And you can very quickly create pop art images with this. But then you can also adjust saturation, which will increase or decrease the intensity of colors. I rarely use this one on a global scale, so adjusting the whole image. Instead, I use it either from the drop down and selecting which color I want to affect, or even better, use the on image editing option. So select the hand tool and then click and drag on the colors you wish to reduce or increase. So click and drag left and right will change the saturation of the selected color values. So I reduce the blues on the sky and then I click on the waves, also drag it to the left, and see how quickly, even without a selection, we managed to remove all the blues from the image and kept the little girl in her original colors. So this was again a selective black and white conversion, but the advantage of this is that we didn't even need to make a selection. Now there's one additional thing that you can use with the hue saturation adjustment layer, and that's if you still have the hand tool selected. By holding down the Command or Control key on PC, you can adjust the hues as well with the same tool. So whatever you click on, you can adjust the hues of those areas. Now I'm going to reset the image just to try this. So holding down Command or Control, I click on the sky, and you can see now we are only affecting the colors of the background, but not the girl. One additional thing useful to know about the hue saturation adjustment is that you can turn on colorize, which is quite similar to the tint option in black and white. Again, it creates a monochrome effect, and then you can still adjust the hue saturation and lightness to make changes. On this next example, I don't want to do the same black and white conversion. I want to increase all the colors in the image, because at the moment they are not really intense. So I want to emphasize all the colors and make them more vibrant. And that's why we are going to use the vibrance adjustment layer. So once I select that, that only gives us two options. So it's a very simple adjustment layer. We can increase vibrance, and then we can also increase saturation. This is the full intensity of this adjustment layer, and you can see before and after it is a major difference. So now looking at the original, it almost looks black and white. When I turn it back on, this is the full intensity. Now, of course, when you feel like an adjustment layer is still not strong enough, even with its full intensity, you can always duplicate it. So you can right click and choose duplicate on the layer. That way you will get double the intensity. Now, there's a reason why it doesn't allow you to go further than what the plus 100 would give you, because it will start to completely mess up the image. I wouldn't recommend to do these type of things, so try to keep it within the range that the adjustment will allow you to do, because most of the time, anything beyond that is going to harm the image. Now, what's the difference between vibrance and saturation? Well, I can show you that very easily by having two versions. On one, I am going to reset the saturation, and the other one, I'm going to reset the vibrance. So at the moment, this one here on the top is 100 vibrance, and this one is going to be saturation. So if I turn off saturation, you can see that's what vibrance does, 100 vibrance. I can turn it off and turn it on. The colors doesn't really get much more intense, because what vibrance does is it tries to equalize the colors. So here mainly, the colors of her eyes, for example, will get more vibrant because they were quite desaturated before. So when I turn on vibrance, this is what you see will mainly change. But really what happens is all the colors will get equalized. So the intensity will be the same on all the colors. On the other hand, if I have the saturation on 100, you see the colors of her eye doesn't change as much, but colors that were already strong, like in the background, will get even stronger. And I would say even too strong compared to all the other colors in the image. What I normally do is I increase vibrance first, and then if I feel like I need a bit more intensity, I add a bit of saturation on top of it. Now, since we are talking about color adjustments, it's important to mention color correction. And for color correction, most of the times we would use the curves adjustment layer. So let me switch to the next example here. We have a nice portrait, but the colors are not perfect. It is sometimes hard to tell whether you have the correct colors or not. But by using the curves adjustment layer, there is a very simple trick to check and almost automatically adjust the colors. So I already added the curves adjustment layer, and then there's 3 eyedroppers here, out of which I normally use the one in the middle. That's the gray eyedropper tool. With this, you should find something on the image that's supposed to be a neutral color. Now, if you know that, let's say she was wearing a gray blouse, you can click on that, and then based on that, you get a great color correction. Sometimes you can also use teeth, for example, which will also give you quite a good result here. The whole point about the gray eyedropper is that you are looking for anything that's a neutral color, which means it's a shade of gray. So something that's not red, green, or blue, and also something that's not too bright or too dark. So when you click on the image on these certain areas where you have a neutral color or where a neutral color is supposed to be, then what happens is that Photoshop neutralizes that color, but based on that adjustment, all the other colors should be corrected and everything should fall in place. So when I turn the adjustment off, you can see now that the image was way too red. So once we have the adjustment on, we see it looks much more healthier, the skin tones and everything looks better. And normally the skin tones are the best as a reference point, because even though we don't know a person, we can tell when the skin tones look realistic or not. And based on that, we can then correct all the other colors in an image. Of course, this only applies if you have people in your images. But I will show you the next example where we won't have any skin tones. But before we move on to that, I just want to point out that this is where you can see exactly what happened with the colors. So the center line is the 0 point. Anything that goes below that gets reduced. Anything above it gets increased. And we can actually see that the red colors were reduced, greens were slightly increased, and the blue got increased even more. So that's exactly the correction. But if I feel like I need to override it, I can always go into these options. Let's say I feel like the red is too low now. I can always select that and drag it slightly up. So you can start with sampling a neutral color with the gray eyedropper, but then you can override it manually if you want to make some changes. Now, if I reset this adjustment, so I just go back to RGB and reset it completely. And just so you remember, apart from color correction, if we stay in RGB and drag these curves up and down, it can also change the tonal values. So it can darken or brighten the image. So it's like a 2-in-1 adjustment layer. But let's go to the next example. I'm going to still use the curves adjustment layer, so I already edit. And once again, we can feel that the colors are not perfect here. Luckily, although we don't have skin tones, we again have gray socks. So using again the eyedropper, we could click on that and see what happens. Depending where you click and what gray color you select, you will get different results. As you can see, each part I click on will give us different results. And probably here on the trousers, actually, we get one of the best results. So we can see before and after. Yeah, after looks definitely better. But if you feel like it's still not perfect, you can always look at the adjustment and intensify it. So if I feel like there's still too much blue in the image, I can go into blue or green and then start adjusting it. I felt like there's still way too much green in the image and also too much blue. So by dragging those down, I see that now looks a bit even better. Of course, here again, it's useful to know the product itself or have a reference in front of you to be able to compare the colors. And color correction is a big topic. We could go into way more detail. But curves is not the only adjustment layer that we can use for color correction. So let me show you this next example. Once again, a portrait. And you probably think it doesn't really need color correction. It looks just fine. And that's true, but it can also be improved. Instead of curves, I'm going to use color balance. So this is the other adjustment layer I prefer to use for correcting colors. And notice that here we have 3 different tonal values. Normally I start in midtones. If I feel like the image needs a little bit more intensity of warmer colors, I can just start dragging towards red and yellows and then have a look at before and after to see what we achieved. You can see that it looks a bit healthier. Before it was slightly too cold, and that's mainly because of the environment and the lights being used. So you can always compensate for that to get a healthier look. And if you feel like it's still not enough, you can of course always go further towards reds and yellows. But I think we actually managed to get to a good adjustment. So turning it off and on again, it's a subtle adjustment, but you can see it works. And don't forget also that we've already seen the camera raw filter also has the temperature option, which is another great way to correct the white balance in images, because that's what we call it, white balance, because if the white is actually white, then all the other colors should be also correct. Now, of course, color correction is a huge topic, and we could go into way more depth exploring other ways and more professional ways of doing color correction. But if you start experimenting with these two adjustment layers, that will already give you a head start, and your images will look way better. To finish off this video with one last adjustment layer, I'm going to show you the gradient map, which is this one here. Now, this is a unique adjustment, which I mainly use for creative effects. What you can do here is to choose a gradient, let's say like this one here, and then the colors within the gradient will be applied on the image, but in a very smart way that the darker details in the image will use the colors from the left side of this gradient, and the brighter colors or highlights in the image will use the right side of the gradient. And of course, the midtones will use whatever is in the middle. So for example, with this gradient, all the shadows in the image will turn blue, the midtones will turn red, and the highlights will turn yellow. And there are many different presets here you can select, and each of them will give you different results. But of course, you can customize the gradient. If you click on the gradient twice, it will come up with the gradient editor where you can adjust these color stops. So we can move the red further down and you immediately see the changes, or we can move it further up. But we can also move all the other color stops around as well. So we can move that down or move it further up. And when you select a color stop, you can even change the color itself. So we can pick maybe a cyan color and immediately it will come up there. Or we can go back to the same color we had before or something similar. You also have a midpoint between two color stops, so you can adjust which one should be more dominant. So you can see the red spreads more into the highlights now. And you can also add new color stops by clicking anywhere on the gradient. And then of course, for this new color stop, we can also define another color. Let's just say a darker, maybe not blue, let's just add a bit of green in the image. Something like that, or maybe purple might look even better. So a darker shade of purple. So if I click OK, you can see now we added an additional color stop, which once again can be moved around. Of course, it was better for the shadows. And if you don't like a color stop, you can also delete it by clicking here on delete. Or you can also change the gradient type from solid to noise, which will give you a very random gradient. I'm just going to go back to solid, which remembers luckily our settings. And what you can also do is that you can save this gradient, but instead of clicking on save, click on new. So that's going to give you the option here. So new will save the current settings. So you will be able to use it next time. And once I click OK, I can see the effect in the background. And just one last option here, you can quickly reverse the gradient. And now you can see that the colors were swapped around. So the bright yellows are now used for the shadows and the dark blues are used for the highlights. And that's all I wanted to show you about color adjustments. So in the next video, we will now focus on contrast adjustments.